Hey, here we are for another video in our What Happens When You Give teaching series. And last week I began a series within the series, if you like. I wanted to take some time to develop the theology of tithing, explaining why we actually teach the principle of tithing and how we can apply that from the scriptures. And so last week we talked about covenantal theology. And today I want to focus on this gentleman here, Melchizedek, who first appears in Genesis chapter 14 as the king of Salem. And Abraham presented him with a tithe of his income. The first mention of several key things. Now, in Scripture, theologians have a principle they call the law of first mention, which means the first time something is mentioned, it's significant. And then from that, you can build and see what other Bible writers have to say to build a doctrine. Now, there are 5 key things when we first hear of this guy, Melchizedek, that we need to take note of. The first one is the fact that Melchizedek himself is actually mentioned, because he'll pop up in other times in Scripture. The second thing is that it's the first time that Jerusalem is mentioned. He's actually called the King of Salem, but it's the city of Jerusalem before it was called Jerusalem. The third thing is it's the first mention of bread and wine, which is obviously significant if you think about that. It's a direct link to communion. The fourth thing is it's the first mention of priests or priesthood anywhere in the Bible. It says that Abraham presented a tithe to Melchizedek, who was a priest king. He wasn't just a king, he was also a priest. And the fifth thing, which is obviously the one we're talking about, is it's the first mention of tithing anywhere in the Bible. So what we want to do is look at how covenantal theology applies to this principle of Melchizedek, especially in view of this issue of tithing. So the first thing to notice is that tithing actually predates the Mosaic covenant. It was a practice of the nations, and certainly in Abraham's case and his grandson Jacob are both referred to as tithing prior to the Mosaic covenant. But then we get there and we need to look at what the tithe is all about. And the tithing was actually instituted by God, and there were actually 3 different tithes. And next week I'll talk to that, the 3 different tithes that were required in the law. But for the sake of it now, we'll just talk about it as a tithe. What was the principle of the primary tithe? Well, it's interesting because the principle of the primary tithe, the reason for the first 10% of their income that people were expected to give under the Mosaic covenant was the priesthood. It was actually for the payment of the priests, to enable them to do their work on behalf of the people, to do God's work on behalf of the rest of the nation. And the times when the tithe wasn't coming in, the priests didn't have enough money, so they had to go back and work in the fields, and that was not God's intention. He intended that people would pay for the priests to minister and do God's work on their behalf. So isn't it interesting that a tithe and the priesthood are directly linked to the priesthood and the tithe up here? So they've taken that principle, and we've seen how it's applied to the Mosaic covenant. The tithe was for the purpose of the priesthood. So then we come to the New Testament, and what we want to do is we want to see whether or not this tithe and priesthood principle and whether this Melchizedek principle actually transfer through into the New Testament. And if we understand that, it's going to affect our doctrine, our theology of tithing. Now, I don't have time to go into all of this, but if you're really hungry to learn, I would recommend that you look at some scriptures. The first scripture is 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Now, you cannot develop a New Testament theology of tithing without going here, because in this passage, Paul is defending his right to receive income from the Corinthians because he's working in the Lord as a minister of the gospel. A direct link, if you like. He's not saying he's a priest, but he is taking Old Testament principle from the Mosaic covenant and applying it to New Testament workers, those people who work in the house of God for the ministry. And he derives it back in a couple of ways. He goes back to the priests that worked in the temple, in the tabernacle in the desert in the book of Numbers. And he says they were able to receive their food from the offerings in the temple. And he actually directly links that to ministers of the gospel. And he says ministers of the gospel have a right to receive food from the people, because they work in the house of God. So there's a direct link back to the priesthood, if you like, in that way. But also, too, in the book of Hebrews, where Melchizedek is mentioned, we learn a lot about about Melchizedek. We actually realize that he is a type of Christ for a couple of reasons. These priests here in the Mosaic covenant, they weren't royalty because they were from the tribe of Levi. But the royal tribe was a different tribe. It was the tribe of Judah. But when we get to the New Testament, we discover something about Jesus. He is actually from the tribe of Judah. That means Jesus is a king. He's royalty. He wears a crown, but he's also a high priest. And he's not a high priest in the same priesthood as the Mosaic covenant, because they were from the tribe of Levi. Jesus wasn't. It actually says he was a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So Jesus is the priest king, which means he's a fulfillment of Melchizedek. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because Abraham paid a tithe to the priest king Melchizedek, and he actually, the New Testament writer of the Hebrews, actually links it and says when we pay our tithes, we are paying it to the priest king Jesus. Therefore, we now have a responsibility to pay tithes to Jesus for the purpose of the ministry of the gospel. And so that is a very clear example to me of why the New Testament actually ratifies and endorses and continues the principle of tithing. In other words, the new covenant does not stop the principle of tithing, it still continues underneath the new covenant. And that's been a great revelation to me. I've not seen it that clearly before, but I'm encouraged by that, and I really think that that's giving me a new authority in my tithing and my giving. And I want to encourage you to know that when you're tithing, when you're committed to that lifestyle of 10% giving to God, you're actually fulfilling a requirement of God, and God will bless you for that. I do hope that all my scribbles on the board have encouraged you. God bless you as you give. I'll talk to you next week.